There's a photograph that haunts the archives of the National Museum of World War II. Black and white, edges yellowed with time, it captures a moment that defies everything we thought we knew about enemies and mercy. Japanese women huddle together in the bitter cold of a Manchurian winter, wrapped not in the rising sun banners they once served, but in thick wool blankets bearing the unmistakable stamp, U.S. Army. Snow swirls around the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling military compound. The year is 1945. The war that consumed the Pacific is gasping its final breaths, and in this forgotten corner of the world, something extraordinary is unfolding. Something that challenges every propaganda poster, every rally cry, every reason these nations gave for tearing each other apart. These women stare into the camera with eyes that have seen their empire crumble. Just months before, they believed with religious fervor that American soldiers were demons incarnate, savage beasts who would show no quarter to the daughters of Japan. Their own military leaders had whispered dark promises. Capture meant torture, humiliation, death. Better to die with honor than face the enemy's wrath. Yet here they sit, alive, breathing, warm. The cruel irony cuts deeper than any bayonet. The very blankets that shield them from the killing cold were woven by the hands of their supposed tormentors. Each thread tells a story their propaganda never prepared them for, a story of choices made in the frozen wasteland where humanity either dies or reveals itself in ways that defy all logic. You can almost hear the questions forming behind their hollow stares. Who are these Americans really? What manner of enemy shares his warmth with those who wished for his destruction? And perhaps most troubling of all, if we were wrong about this, what else did we believe that was nothing more than care, fully crafted lies? This photograph doesn't just capture a moment in time. It freezes the exact instant when everything these women thought they knew about good and evil, about us and them, about the very nature of war itself, began to crack like ice under spring sun. Their journey to this moment, and what happened after, reveals one of the most profound contradictions of the Second World War. To understand the shock written across their faces, we must first understand who these women were before they became prisoners, before they learned that enemies could be merciful. Meet Akiko Tanizaki, 22 years old, trained as a radio operator in the Women's National Defense Association. Like thousands of her sisters across the Japanese Empire, she had volunteered not just her service, but her very soul to the cause of the rising sun. Her diary, discovered decades later in a Kyoto attic, reveals the depth of her indoctrination. Today, Sensei taught us that death is lighter than a feather, but duty heavier than a mountain. I pray the Emperor will find me worthy of both. These weren't reluctant conscripts dragged into service. They were true believers, raised from childhood on stories of divine wind and sacred mission. Nurse Keiko Yamamoto left her medical studies at Tokyo Imperial University to serve at a field hospital in Manchuria. Her letters home brimmed with purpose. I will heal our glorious soldiers so they may continue the fight against the white devils who seek to poison Asia with their corruption. The Women's National Defense Association had done its work well. Through school assemblies and neighborhood meetings, through shrine visits and ceremonial teas, they had woven an unshakable truth into the fabric of these young lives. Americans were not merely enemies, they were something less than human. Propaganda films showed U.S. Marines with fangs and claws. Newsreels depicted Allied soldiers desecrating temples and murdering children. The message was clear and constant. Capture by such beasts would mean a fate worse than death. Typist Hiroko Sato practiced her shorthand by transcribing speeches that promised American soldiers would torture Japanese women before killing them slowly. Radio operator Michiko Abe transmitted coordinates for defensive POWs, missions while humming songs that celebrated martyrdom over surrender. They went to sleep each night knowing that if the unthinkable happened, if Japan's defenses failed, they possessed one final sacred duty: to die rather than face the enemy's savagery. But knowing how to die with honor and actually facing that moment are vastly different things. As 1945 wore on and news from the Pacific grew darker, these women found themselves wrestling with questions their training had never addressed. What happens when the empire that demands your death suddenly seems mortal itself? When the divine winds fail to blow? When the sacred mission begins to feel less like destiny and more like delusion? None of them imagined they would live long enough to discover the answers. None of them dreamed they would survive to write in their diaries about American hands offering Japanese prisoners cups of hot soup. They had been prepared for death, for glory, for sacrifice on the altar of imperial dreams. They had never been prepared for kindness from the enemy. That education was about to begin in the most brutal classroom imaginable, the collapsing frontiers of a dying empire. The first cracks appeared not in the grand theatres of war that historians love to chronicle, but in the mundane details that make empires human, and therefore fragile. By August 1945, the Women's National Defense Units stationed across Manchuria were living on rice mixed with sawdust. Supply lines that once moved with the precision of Swiss clockwork now resembled broken spiderwebs, tangled and useless. The divine winds that were supposed to protect Japan had somehow forgotten to shield the women who served faithfully at the empire's farthest edges. Keiko Yamamoto, the nurse who had once written home about healing glorious soldiers, now found herself treating teenage conscripts who wept openly for their mothers. Her medical supplies had dwindled to strips of cloth torn from her own uniform and bottles of sake that burned like fire when poured over infected wounds. In her diary, the tone shifts from patriotic fervor to something approaching desperation. The soldiers no longer sing the war songs. They stare at maps as if the lines might rearrange themselves through pure will. Then came August 9th, and with it the Soviet bear awakening from its Western hibernation. The Red Army struck with a fury that made American island-hopping campaigns look like chess matches. Tank columns stretched beyond the horizon, aircraft darkened the sky like steel locusts, and artillery barrages turned ancient Manchurian cities into rubble in the span of hours. The women's evacuation was planned with the same attention to detail that had characterized everything about their service, which is to say, barely at all. Hiroko Sato found herself crammed into a freight train with 40 other women, their radio equipment abandoned on platforms as panicked officers shouted contradictory orders into the chaos. The train that was supposed to carry them to safety became a slow-moving targ, it crawling through territory that changed hands hourly. Akiko Tanizaki's unit never made it to their train. Soviet advance scouts overran their position just after dawn on August the 12th. She wrote later of that moment when her commanding officer, Colonel Ishida, gathered the women in a circle and began the ritual words they had practiced so many times. Death before dishonor. Death before... But his voice cracked. The words that had sounded so noble in training now felt hollow in the face of actual annihilation. For 3 days they huddled in the ruins of a bombed schoolhouse, sharing the last of their emergency rations and listening to the sound of war creeping closer. Some of the younger women spoke in whispers of following their training, of ending things with honor while they still possessed the choice. Others simply stared at their hands, perhaps wondering how life had led them to this frozen moment between duty and survival. When the American voices finally called through the rubble, "Come out, hands visible," they emerged expecting to meet the demons from their childhood nightmares. Instead, they found themselves face to face with soldiers who looked surprisingly, disturbingly human. Young men with mud on their boots and exhaustion in their eyes, carrying weapons that could have ended everything in seconds. But those weapons remained lowered, and in that small mercy the first cracks appeared in everything they thought they knew about enemies and war. Sergeant Bill Morrison from Topeka, Kansas, had been briefed to expect trouble. Intelligence reports suggested Japanese military women might attempt suicide attacks, hiding grenades beneath their clothing or concealing poison pills in their mouths. As the transport truck rolled through the gates of the makeshift POW facility near Mukden, Morrison and his men checked their weapons one final time and prepared for the worst. What they found instead were 23 Japanese women who looked like they hadn't eaten in weeks. Morrison later wrote to his wife, "Martha, I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. They looked so small, so scared. One of them couldn't have been older than our Jenny, and she was shaking so hard I thought she might collapse right there in the snow." The women descended from the truck in single file, their movements precise despite their obvious weakness. They had been taught to maintain dignity even in capture, though nothing in their training had prepared them for capture that felt less like conquest and more like rescue. Their clothes hung loose on diminished frames, and their lips were cracked from dehydration and cold. Nurse Keiko Yamamoto would later describe that first moment of contact. "I expected rough hands, harsh words, perhaps immediate violence. Instead, the American sergeant removed his helmet and spoke to us as if we were people, not enemies, not prisoners, just people who needed help." When Sergeant Morrison noticed Akiko Tanizaki swaying on her feet, his instinct overrode his training. He untied the thick wool blanket from his pack, standard issue, olive drab, scratchy but warm, and held it out toward her. The gesture was simple, automatic, the kind of thing any decent person might do when confronted with obvious suffering. But to Akiko, raised on stories of American cruelty, the blanket might as well have been hand-tied, it down from another universe. She stared at it, then at Morrison's face, searching for the trap, the hidden malice, the catch that would reveal this kindness as elaborate cruelty. Finding none, she began to bow repeatedly, her training insisting that even accepting help from an enemy required the proper forms of respect. Morrison didn't understand the bowing, but he understood cold. He gently draped the blanket around her shoulders and stepped back, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. Other soldiers, witnessing this exchange, began reaching for their own emergency supplies. Soon, wool blankets marked with American eagles were being distributed to Japanese women who had spent years learning to fear those very symbols. Hiroko Sato, watching this impossible scene unfold, would write years later, "In that moment, I realized my teachers had prepared me for everything except the possibility that the enemy might be human. It was the most terrifying realization of my entire life. Because if they were human, what did that make us?" The thermometer outside the Mukden camp medical station read -18 degrees Fahrenheit, on the morning when everything the women thought they knew about Americans began to unravel completely. Corporal Danny Ricci, a medic from the Bronx, had been treating frostbite cases all week. Both American prisoners of war liberated from Japanese camps and the Japanese women who had become prisoners themselves. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own hands, chapped and bleeding from the cold, worked with equal care on feet that had marched for opposing armies. Akiko Tanizaki watched through the medical tent's canvas flap as Ricci gently cleaned infected toes belonging to Michiko Abe, the radio operator who had once transmitted coordinates for artillery strikes against American positions. Ricci hummed while he worked, something that sounded like a jazz tune, and occasionally made small jokes in broken Japanese that made Michiko smile despite herself. This was not the behavior described in any of the propaganda films they had watched. American soldiers were supposed to be brutal, sadistic, devoid of normal human compassion. Yet here was this young man, barely older than her brother back in Hiroshima, treating their wounds with a gentleness that reminded her of her father bandaging scraped knees. The contradictions multiplied daily like frost on windows. When dysentery struck the women's barracks, American medics shared their precious penicillin supplies without hesitation. When Keiko Yamamoto collapsed from malnutrition, it was Sergeant Morrison who carried her to the medical tent and sat by her bedside until the fever broke, even though she had spent months training to kill men exactly like him. But perhaps the most profound contradiction came in the form of laughter. Despite everything, the cold, the uncertainty, the weight of defeat, the American soldiers still found reason to laugh. They played cards with cigarettes as stakes, told stories about girlfriends back home, and shared photographs of younger brothers and pet dogs. Their humanity was so casual, so unguarded, that it became impossible to maintain the carefully constructed hatred that had sustained the women through years of war. Hiroko Sato began keeping a secret diary, hidden beneath her sleeping mat. Her entries from this period read like dispatches from an alien world. Today, the soldier they call Red shared his chocolate ration with Tanaka-san, even though she tried to refuse. Yesterday, I heard their medic singing a lullaby to comfort Watanabe-san when her nightmares became too loud. I no longer understand what we were fighting for or against. The winter deepened, and with it, the women's confusion. Every day brought new evidence that their enemies possessed the same capacity for kindness, fear, homesickness, and hope that they themselves carried. It was a realization more devastating than any military defeat, because it suggested that everything they had sacrificed, everything they had believed, might have been built on lies as fragile as morning frost. In the long hours between meals and medical checks, when the camp settled into the peculiar quiet of defeated armies, the women wrote letters they would never mail. Keiko Yamamoto's unsent correspondence to her mother in Kyoto reveals the psychological turmoil that accompanies the collapse of absolute certainty. Honorable Mother, I do not know how to tell you that our enemies have shown me more kindness in captivity than our own officers did in service. The American medic who tends my frostbite has gentle hands and asks about my pain in words I barely understand, but somehow feel completely. How do I explain that I am learning to trust those we were taught to hate? These letters, discovered decades later by historians, provide an intimate window into minds grappling with cognitive dissonance on an almost unbearable scale. Akiko Tanizaki wrote page after page to her dead brother, killed at Iwo Jima. Hiroshi, the Americans who killed you have given me their blankets to keep me warm. I do not understand this war anymore. I do not understand what your death was for. The women found themselves caught between two impossible truths. The first, their training, their culture, their entire worldview insisted that these American soldiers were monsters capable of unspeakable cruelty. The second, their daily experience provided overwhelming evidence of ordinary human decency, even kindness, from the very people they had been taught to fear. Hiroko Sato's letters to her parents reveal a young woman essentially rebuilding her understanding of morality from scratch. Father, you taught me that honor meant choosing death over capture. But what honor is there in dying when life might still serve some purpose? The American chaplain speaks of forgiveness as if it were possible even between enemies. I find myself wanting to believe him, and this desire terrifies me more than Artil's. Airy ever did. Some letters were never finished, abandoned mid-sentence, as if the writers could not bear to complete thoughts that challenged everything they had once held sacred. Others rambled for pages, circling around questions that had no easy answers. If Americans could be kind, what did that make the Japanese soldiers who had committed atrocities in occupied territories? If enemies could show mercy, what was the true nature of the conflict that had consumed their lives? The most heartbreaking entries came from women writing to sweethearts who would never read their words. My beloved, I lived because strangers chose mercy over vengeance. I do not know if this makes me a coward or simply human. I do not know if I will ever be worthy of the home I left behind. Christmas Eve, 1945. The snow fell soft and steady over the Mukden camp, muffling sound and softening the harsh edges of barbed wire and guard towers. For the American soldiers, it was a night for remembering home, for sharing whatever small comforts they could cobble together from military rations and care packages that had somehow survived the Pacific crossing. Chaplain Robert Mackenzie had organized a simple service in the camp's largest tent. Nothing elaborate, some hymns sung a cappella, a brief reading from the Gospel of Luke, and a moment of silence for those who wouldn't be coming home. The American personnel attendance was voluntary, and about half the men showed up, their breath visible in the cold air as they sang Silent Night, with voices roughened by months of combat. The Japanese women weren't invited, of course. They practiced different faiths, spoke a different language, and had spent years learning to see Christian symbols as emblems of enemy aggression. But human curiosity transcends such boundaries, and as the voices carried across the frozen compound, small groups of women began gathering near the fence that separated their quarters from the main camp. They stood in the shadows, close enough to hear but far enough to retreat if their presence proved unwelcome. Akiko Tanizaki found herself drawn by the melody more than the meaning. There was something in the harmony that reminded her of temple songs from her childhood, a similar reaching towards something larger than individual suffering. Sergeant Morrison noticed them first, their silhouettes barely visible against the snow-covered landscape. He nudged Corporal Ritchie, who glanced over and made the same calculation Morrison had. These women were cold, curious, and keeping respectful distance. No threat, just fellow human beings drawn to light and music on a bitter winter night. Without discussion, or fanfare, the Americans began a quiet redistribution of resources. Extra wool blankets appeared from personal packs. Thermoses of hot coffee, precious beyond measure in the frozen wasteland, were carried across the compound. No grand gestures, no speeches about international brotherhood, just soldiers sharing what little warmth they had with people who needed it more. The Japanese women accepted these offerings with deep bows and whispered thanks in their own language. No common words were exchanged, but language proved unnecessary. In the glow of improvised lanterns, surrounded by the gentle hiss of falling snow, the artificial boundaries that separated captors from captives seemed to dissolve into something more fundamental. Human beings caring for other human beings on a night when the world felt especially cold and fragile. As the service ended and men began drifting back to their quarters, the women remained for a few minutes longer, wrapped in American wool, listening to the silence that follows shared grace. The war ended officially on September 2nd, 1945, but for the women in the Mukden camp, the real ending came gradually, in a series of small revelations that would echo through their remaining years. Repatriation ships arrived in October, bringing the complex emotions that accompany survival when so many others had perished. Akiko Tanizaki stood on the deck of a converted cargo vessel, watching the Chinese coastline fade into Pacific haze, clutching a worn wool blanket that still smelled faintly of American cigarettes and honest sweat. She had tried to return it to Sergeant Morrison before departing, but he had pressed it back into her hands with words she didn't understand, but somehow felt completely. Home was a word that had lost its meaning. Japan, in late 1945, was a nation of ruins, populated by survivors who had their own complex relationships with defeat and shame. The women who returned from Manchurian camps found themselves occupying an uncomfortable space in the national narrative. They had served the empire faithfully, but they had also lived when honor supposedly demanded death. They had seen the enemy's humanity, which complicated the clean story of righteous struggle against demonic oppression. Most never spoke publicly about their experiences. Keiko Yamamoto returned to nursing, working in hospitals that treated American occupation forces alongside Japanese patients. She never mentioned to her colleagues that she had once been cared for by American medics, that she had learned gentleness could exist even between enemies. Some truths were too complex for a society trying to rebuild its identity on simpler foundations. But in private moments, in letters to trusted friends, in diaries kept hidden from curious family members, the truth emerged in fragments. Hiroko Sato would later write, "The greatest shock of captivity was not brutality, but its absence. I had prepared my soul for torture and found instead men who shared their coffee and asked about my health. This kindness haunts me more than cruelty ever could, because it suggests that wars are fought between human beings who might, under different circumstances, have been friends." Decades later, when historians began interviewing elderly Japanese women about their wartime experiences, these testimonies would surface like messages in bottles washing ashore from a distant conflict. They spoke of American soldiers who could have been monsters but chose to be men. Of wool blankets that provided more than warmth, they provided evidence that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion finds ways to survive, to cross boundaries that seemed absolute, to remind us that the most powerful victories are sometimes the quietest ones. The photograph that began our story continues to hang in museum archives, a frozen moment of complexity in a world that prefers simple narratives. But for those who lived through that winter of contradictions, the real memorial isn't captured in any image. It lives in the memory of enemies who chose mercy, and the recognition that sometimes humanity's greatest triumph is found not in victory, but in how we treat those we have defeated.